Yeah, welcome. Thanks for coming. My name is Jakob. I'm one of the two founders of Camunda, also CEO. One question perhaps to begin with. Who of you is already familiar with the Camunda product stack? Just raise your hands if you know the stack, basically. Cool. That's also my basic assumption. So if I can find the clicker over here. The idea of this first session is not so much to introduce you to the stack and talk through all the parts of it. This is going to happen in the next session where my colleague Ragnar is going to demonstrate the whole product stack. So the idea of this session is that when you already have a basic idea what Camunda is about, to introduce you to a few of the learnings that we have made in terms of best practices, avoidable pitfalls, etc., over the past few years. And those learnings obviously come from our customer base. So we have around 250, I think close to 80 customers now in all kinds of different industries and territories. So you can basically divide them in those three buckets, if you will. One is the more corporate bucket, where we're looking at the established organizations, mostly in financial services, insurances, telecommunications, media, energy, utilities, but also 24 fitness, for example, so a few more exotic examples. They typically want to use Camunda to transform their business digitally, to become that digital enterprise that everyone's talking about nowadays. And then we have on the right-hand side, let's say the challengers, the startups that create greenfield tech stacks as a fintech, insurtech, etc., that want to use Camunda to create completely new, innovative business models that they would use to disrupt those established industries. And obviously, we have the public sector here as well. So in the UK, for example, the Ministry of Justice. So from all those different customers come a lot of experiences that we have made as they implement Camunda in their projects, our consultants helping them, our customer success team coordinating or coordinating the project support on our side, and so on and so forth. And the first thing I would like to do is I would like to just highlight 3 examples of typical Camunda use cases or projects, because we can derive certain common patterns from that. And this is based on our user conference, CamundaCon. So in this first example, we're looking at a company called Duni. They manufacture napkins, basically, and they do that in a B2B fashion, which means that if you have let's say, a hotel chain or restaurant chain, you want to have customized napkins with your logo printed on, for example, you would work with them, you would order them, and that order process doesn't happen too often every year. It's a big, let's say, transaction value, but it's not a big transaction volume, which means that they get, let's say, a few thousand orders per year, and this is their order handling process here. And as you can, not see, but I can tell you, this process consists of a few steps that are automated, like calling few API services, but mostly it's user tasks, which means in BPMN that there's people in front of the computer that get a task presented. They're supposed to complete that task, like approving, for example, a certain order, and then the process continues. As you can also see in this heat map, which is one of the features that we have in the stack, there are certain parts of the process that are executed more often than others. So for example, this little shortcut up there, but then also this path over here. And then there's a few loops that can happen in between, which are not executed that often. Those are correction loops in case there are unexpected circumstances. So the intention for a company like Duni is to streamline that process. They call it the happy path. It's a common term in process management. So they want to follow the happy path as often as possible, and Camunda gives them the visibility and the assurance that this is actually happening. So they're organizing human work in a way that is more streamlined and more structured. That is one typical situation for Camunda. Another one is from a German insurance company, the third largest insurance actually in Germany, called Talanx, and they're selling, besides other things, car insurances. So car insurances is obviously a B2C business. So they have many transactions per year, and they want to automate them as much as possible in order to have the business scalability in place. And as you can see here again, that heat map feature, their happy path is it's literally straight through processing. So it should happen completely automated. That was their goal. They increased that automatic processing rate to 97%. 99% within 3 months after Camunda introduction. And as you can see here, only in few exceptional cases, people in front of a computer again look at those car insurance applications, so to speak. And then the third example is from aforementioned 24-Hour Fitness, the world's biggest gym chain, basically, in the US. And in their case, they have a lot of BPMN process models deployed in production, like more than 300, in fact. Those models are actually quite small, if you will, fragmented, and they're fairly technical. So in the Thailand's example, it was more of a end-to-end business process model that expressed the process from a business standpoint, at the same time displaying the source code because it's automated in Camunda. Here, we have fairly technical models that are about things like load search, lead request style sheet, call transformer, call search lead. This is not very relevant for the business side. However, within the IT department and the developer force, it is a very handy tool so that the developers know what kind of source code they're actually composing. So because it's pretty fragmented and because 24-Hour Fitness uses Camunda to run the entire business, they have a lot of executions. So it's close to 100 million executions per day regarding those little boxes. So this easily ends up to billions of transactions per year. So when we compare now those 3 examples on a more abstract level, it gives a good picture of the variety of use cases we're looking at with Camunda. So we have here on the left-hand side the very human workflow-oriented situations. Typical business use cases are the B2B business. For example, if you look at certain banks in Switzerland, the customer onboarding, know your customer process, any kind of approval basically, let it be in purchasing, in HR or whatnot, is an example for that. So the human involvement is in default. And they typically don't have so many transactions, aka process instances, technically speaking, per year, but each transaction is relatively valuable. And one of the core values, besides the general benefit of visibility, is that we structure human work. Now moving here to the right-hand side, again, with the insurance example, it's more about B2C. Other examples are Zalando, the world's, or at least Europe's biggest fashion retailer, executing all their orders on Camunda. So millions of orders per year, in fact. And telco, like German Telecom selling, landlines to their customers, stuff like that. So those are typical examples for this end-to-end process automation, where human involvement is more the exception, and they want to automate as much as possible, which means that each transaction is of a, let's say, medium value. It has to be very scalable, very efficient in terms of margins. And then we have the right-hand side, where we're really looking at billions of transactions per year, like in 24-Hour Fitness, but for example also when we're looking at resolving batch processing. So when we, for example, imagine banks that want to provide customer experiences in let's say, real time, they cannot afford anymore to run customer service requests overnight, in batches on the mainframe, like they used to do, and still do sometimes. So they need to unbundle those batches and process each request as soon as it comes in, which then leads to, again, a lot of transactions per year. So as you can imagine, one sweet spot for Camunda, and when you wonder, or if you wonder where we're headed, one sweet spot is actually this middle tier, but technically on the scale of the right-hand tier, which explains why we're investing in certain things such as ZB and high-scale workflow automation technology. So for the projects now, this means that pretty often, of course, we're looking at automating manual work, paper-based work, but just as often we are simply improving something that has been implemented already, but in a legacy technology. This can be, for example, some heavyweight BPMS product. Don't want to bash now specific vendors, but just think the big vendors, and most of them have BPM products that came out in the 2000s. Look at certain Magic Quadrants, you can find them. So pretty often we have customers who would like to replace them with Camunda because it's more lightweight, developer-oriented, and so forth. So that's quite common. What's also quite common is that we're looking at other products that have workflows kind of embedded. So think Lotus Notes, for example, when we think human workflow. But also certain ECM products or document management systems that have workflows inside, and customers want to externalize those workflows to make them explicit, more flexible, that they can change them more often, and so on. That's also very common. And of course, stuff that is homegrown. So hard-coded workflows in Java, in COBOL, sometimes even, and things like that. They want to lift that to the next level. One example I like in particular is some media company. They deliver digital content to iTunes and Amazon and so on. And they used to do that on Oracle PLSQL procedures. So that didn't scale anymore at a certain point. So you could call that a homegrown implementation, and they replaced that with Camunda for the sake of scalability. Sometimes we have software vendors like Gainsight, Autodesk, and others that want to provide workflow features within their products, so their users don't even know that Camunda is in there. That's also quite common because Camunda is embeddable. And also quite often we have big organizations that want to provide one centrally managed workflow infrastructure that they can then provide to those decentralized IT units that makes it easier for them to quickly implement workflows for their business lines that they are serving. So especially in bigger financial services, for example, but again also telco, etc., and that's a fairly common use case. And here on the right-hand side, you find the typical ambitions that people pursue with Camunda. Obviously, it's very much about customer experience. I mentioned the example with the batch processing, which is exactly about that. Visibility is a big thing, seeing what's actually going on for single process instances or cases, as well as, let's say, within a month for all the cases. Being more flexible. So, for example, T-Mobile in Austria introduced Camunda to have a flexibility layer, so to speak, on top of all their services that makes it easier to recompose certain services to offer new data plans quicker to the market. So getting that flexibility is a big thing. Cost, obviously, throughput, scalability. I mentioned the media example. All right, so for the project, it means quite often that we have a pretty diverse set of stakeholders. So Camunda is developer-oriented, which means that we typically, when we speak clients, sell to the IT department. We are being approached by developers that have adopted the open source version of Camunda. They like it a lot. They have proposed that in their organization. Enterprise architects, putting together some blueprint reference architecture that then also covers workflow, for example. And then the IT project leads, the BAs involved, and so on, that are all serving the business lines that are requesting or needing certain solutions. And those business lines, again, can be anything, of course, like the damage claim settlement department at an insurance, can be some BSS unit at a telco, whatever. But we typically find, those stakeholder categories like line managers, the people working in those lines, and again, some project lead. And then we have certain roles in those projects because we can derive from that which parts also of Camunda should be exposed to those roles. So, for example, a process owner is often looking at Optimize, one of our components, to get real-time insights in reports, what's going on in the processes that were automated. It also means that we have certain best practices, obviously, that we have derived from those projects. So in general, they take between 3 and 9 months. Of course, sometimes way quicker. Sometimes it can take 3 or 4 years. So, but those are more the outliers. Typically 3 to 9 months, and they're typically built in-house or by solution providers that create turnkey solutions for their clients, or something in between. Quite often it's a blend, where they have their own software development team working on the solution, and then they enhance that with outside contractors, advisors, and so on. And in terms of roles, obviously the developers are key, which is one of the reasons why Camunda is so developer-oriented. The architects often overseeing multiple projects in terms of, are they following the blueprint, the leads, and then the BAs. Of course, there's others involved, but on a daily basis, it's typically those roles. So the BAs is just a placeholder for any kind of, bridge person that bridges the gap between the business lines and the IT unit. So what has worked out pretty well? I mean, one thing is pretty obvious, I guess. It's the agile development paradigm, but I still like to stress and emphasize that. We're still seeing organizations that are pretty waterfall-oriented in terms of their software development approach. And of course, you can do that. Camunda is agnostic. But actually, the whole idea of incremental development plays extremely well with vehicles like BPMN and DMN as a common language for the stakeholders. So quickly changing a BPMN process model, seeing how this performs then in execution, checking in with the business line if that makes sense to them, if the process is changed in that way. So and going through that cycle again and again and again. And that's a typical agile paradigm that is very well supported by Camunda as a product and BPMN as a standard, for example. So it makes a ton of sense to bet on that. And this then goes hand in hand, obviously, with the collaboration aspect. Yes, within the technical stakeholders, but in particular also between the technical stakeholders and the business side. And again, it appears obvious, but way too often it is ignored by, let's say, more conservative organizations or respective stakeholders. So this whole approach really requires the business lines and the developers to work hand in hand. The closer, the better. The more synchronous, the better. So, really sitting down together, designing those models together, or at least, one side designing it, the other side quickly confirming it. And it doesn't really matter if it's the business line designing it or the IT side designing it. Both can make sense. It depends on how sophisticated, which brings us to the third point, the stakeholders are in terms of those standards. So being proficient in BPMN and DMN, if you want to do decision automation as well, is obviously key. And again, it's more than just, let's say, reading a nice book. Nice book is helpful. However, really practicing it and getting feedback on patterns, for example, comes a long way. This one here is about the technical architecture. And there's a lot of things here. You can be both too careless, but you can also be too, let's say, over-engineering. So we have seen enterprise architects who are very ambitious and love to, create lots of abstraction layers so that they can perhaps one day rip out one engine and replace it with another one and don't need to worry about certain implementation details. This can be nice, but at the same time, there's a concept called YAGNI, which stands for you ain't gonna need it. And this applies pretty often to enterprise architecture. So being straightforward and focusing on the one project at hand often makes more sense than creating, this everlasting super architecture. At the same time, thinking about, resilience and scalability is obviously very important. This is, for example, about high availability, active deployments and stuff like that. But for example, also about, how do I want to handle data? And data that is produced by the engine, let's say, at scale. Then we have a history database at Camunda. Okay, maybe I should think about cleaning up that history database in regular intervals so that my database doesn't explode. But where do I keep those data then? Then I might use Optimize that pulls the data into Elasticsearch where I can keep it forever, basically. That can be one approach. There's others. That's the kind of stuff that makes sense to think about when setting up the project for success from a technical architecture standpoint. Much more obviously. This one, again, apparently obvious, often underestimated. So we've often seen people who say, yeah, of course, we have Java developers, and then in fact, they have not even read a Java book. So they're simply underestimating the capacity in terms of skills and that you should have in place, not because of Camunda, but because of software development as a practice. And this can be a particular problem when your organization has outsourced a lot to service providers in the past decades. So not elaborating on that too much, but we have the hypothesis that no matter if it's financial services or insurance or telco, they are all becoming tech companies, which means they need to ramp up their development practice. And that's why the CEO of Goldman Sachs, for example, used to say, Goldman Sachs is a tech company. We have more developers than LinkedIn or Facebook, and they actually do have more developers than them. So it means that recognizing software development as a key competence of your own organization is a strategic matter here. That's pretty clear. All right. No. Oh. So when we look at the projects, again, it's not super Camunda specific, but there are a few things that then kick in because of process automation. So We have, of course, some preparation phase. You're evaluating options, etc. Then you're actually building a solution, and then you go live and operate that technology, that solution. So this doesn't mean that it's not only about Camunda. You can have the platform in place already, and then you have multiple projects for multiple solutions. You will always go through those stages, obviously. And deliberately, I did not put design and implement, in two separate arrows, because it's not sequential. It's not waterfall. It's incremental. So you're going to design, build, then redesign, build again on a small scale as well as on a big scale. But there are certain milestones where it's hard to go back, like the actual kickoff of the project and the actual go live when you tell your business line, here's the solution, go ahead, you can use it. So you typically have those activities in those stages. And as you can imagine, in this stage, design and implement, again, stuff like BPMN and DMN is key, as well as a technology. Besides Camunda, your preferred tech stack doesn't have to be Java, can be .NET or JavaScript or NPM, Node.js, whatever. And what's obviously also quite important is that once you are in production with your solution, things will break. Of course, like they're bound to break. So you need to find a way to quickly figure out that stuff is broken and that you find the root cause and that you then fix that root cause. It's typical application management, basically. But with Camunda, there's a few things in place that make it easier, a bit like a layer that we're going to look at in a second. This one is often a bit, let's say, forgotten, like a forgotten aftermath. If you really want to succeed with your project, you need to make it measurable and clear that you are successful. You need to communicate that to all respective stakeholders, because that will get their buy-in for the next project, obviously, for horizontal expansion. So again, question is, how can you do that? What's perhaps a bit specific about process automation that you can then leverage? And one thing that is important is to have in mind that we have those project stages. At the same time, we have this abstract idea of process improvement cycles. You will always find those charts, like design, implement, operate, analyze. And this is a bit misleading because, again, it suggests that you will design completely, and after you've designed, then you will implement, and then you will go live. And after you're finished operating, you will analyze. That doesn't make sense, obviously. So it's more of a concept in terms of, those things always happen, and they happen in an iterative order. But mapping that to the project stages, obviously, certain things happen in an incremental way within those stages. And what's always helpful to understand here as well is that, we have this, technical operations, and doing technical operations, two things can happen. Either we adjust things on a small scale. So we might fix a bug, yes, but we also might, for example, improve, let's say, a DMN decision table slightly. Hey, there's certain rules that kick in, but we have discovered that, this one rule doesn't make sense. Let's adjust that. There's certain ways in Camunda to do that, even like in flight, without redeploying your application. So here you can relatively agile fix things on a small scale, but you need to understand at what point you really need to go through the next, let's say, life cycle of your solution and say, we need to go back to drawing board, look at certain KPIs that we have measured, and figure that, under certain circumstances, the process takes way too long, or there's way too many correction loops. So let's really dive in and create the better next version of that solution. So one thing that people almost always ask is, there's this open source version of Camunda, Community Edition. It's available for free. So, and then you have this enterprise offering that costs money. So why would I look at the enterprise offering? Under what circumstances is the open source version fine? Do you actually recommend using open source at all, or do you always advise against that, stuff like that? And we're obviously biased in the sense that we have commercial interests. At the same time, we're also passionate about creating technology that actually makes sense and is valuable without the need for signing up for enterprise. So for example, there's NASA. NASA used the open source version of Camunda for the Mars 2020 mission, and they obviously use that for free, and we're happy, about that. So there's many use cases or situations where open source is just fine, and I would like to explain how they look like, and of course explain where the enterprise version makes a difference, and then it's always up to you to decide, obviously. So first a few facts. The open source version, the community version of Camunda, in terms of technology, is the two engines, so the workflow engine for BPMN, for process automation, and the decision engine for DMN, which means decision table automation. So those are available for free, open source completely. You can just use that. You can use that under the hood in an API-based fashion with Java or REST. In addition, we have the modeler, which is about creating, editing, etc., BPMN and DMN models on your computer. So it's a local tool. You downloaded it, and then you edit those files directly. We have Cockpit, which is about seeing what's going on once you have deployed your models in production. Here, first noteworthy difference is that the open source version of Cockpit comes with a relatively rudimentary feature set. So I can, for example, only look at stuff that is happening right now. I cannot look at stuff that has happened already. So I can see my process instance is pending in this step, but I would not see that it has executed those steps before, which makes a difference, obviously. And then we have task list, which is this user front end. If you have human task workers and you want to provide something to them as an inbox, you don't have to use it, but you can use it out of the box. Again, available open source. Now, contrasting that to the enterprise offering, it means that we have two more components, and we have the enterprise version of Cockpit. So here on the left-hand side, we have Cavimo, which stands for Camunda Web Modeler. And again, Ragnar is going to demo those in more detail, so I'm just covering it now superficially. So the difference between Cavimo and Modeler is that Cavimo is all about collaboration. It works in the browser, on the server, SaaS provided by us, or in-house on-premise with your data center, and you can, work together on process models and hence involve all respective stakeholders in process design and process analysis. And that's one important difference here. I mentioned the enterprise cockpit, which comes with the history insights, as well as lots of features for handling incidents, like fixing process instances, setting them back to a certain step, run them again, migrate them to a new version. There's a ton of stuff here that we have implemented for mission-critical process operations in the enterprise. And then Optimize, which is basically the BI tool for process automation. So your business stakeholders can create reports, see what's going on, with bar charts, pie charts, those nice heat maps that I demonstrated. So this is all Optimize. I will explain what this means for the project in a second, but first the facts. In addition to that full stack, we have the professional services, which is the SLA-based support, obviously, and then also the consulting practice with coaching and reviews, and the classroom and on-site trainings. What's missing here is a dedicated team called Customer Success Management on our side, which also plays a bigger and bigger role nowadays. They're more proactive. So consulting, for example, is more reactive. When you say, I'd like a review, I'd like a coaching, they come on site, deliver that coaching. What CSM does is they check in with you. They say, hey, how's your project going? Yeah, well, it's going fairly well, but I don't know, we're struggling at this particular point. We're not sure about how to set up the tech architecture, for example, for scalability. And then CSM goes, well, okay, it sounds a bit like, you're strong here and there, but you have a certain weakness in terms of understanding over there. Let me check if we can provide a training or a coaching that can help you here. So they're more proactive, obviously, and hence also guide and steer your project towards success. Yeah, so speaking of, this means that when now looking at this added value of enterprise, we should distinguish between risk management and value and success. It means that certain things, the red boxes basically, you need to have in place in order to be successful. You can probably or certainly get them without signing up for enterprise. So there's always other ways, but enterprise delivers on that as well. Which means that, for example, you're setting out in the design stage of your project, you need to understand BPMN and DMN. You can read a book, sure. You can, book a training with whoever. But you can, of course, also work with us. Same goes for the technology stack. And then very often architecture review. Hey, we're planning to use, Galera cluster. Is that a good idea? Well, perhaps not. It depends. So having someone who comes on site or remotely and discusses your intended architecture has made a world of difference from our experience. So that's critical, for example. Also critical is once you implement your stuff, are we heading in the right direction? Does it make sense to design the BPMN in that way? For some reason, my business stakeholders, look at it and they just don't get it. So what's the problem here? Are there patterns that make the model more understandable? just show it to us and we can look it up and see what you have done there and perhaps make improvements. Same for code reviews, best practices. So here again, we have the consulting, CSM on the one side, but also the SLA-based support on the other side, like getting answers to your questions within a defined time frame. Yeah, you might discover weird behavior about Camunda. There can always be bugs, but you're not sure. You report it, we validate it, might be a bug, then we're going to fix it and release a patch, or we find out that it's actually not a bug, but just a misconception, for example, can also happen just as well. On the feature side, it means that Cavimo, as you can see, plays a big role in all those stages. So you would think, hey, it's just relevant for the design stage because I want to pull in my stakeholders and get them all on the same table virtually on the same model and discuss, how the process could look like with comments and, chat and stuff like that. It's a bit like Google Docs for process modeling, basically. That's how Cavimo is designed. However, we've discovered that this plays a big role throughout the whole project lifecycle. So also doing implementation. Hey, we've changed the model because we figured technically it makes more sense to do it in that order. Is that okay? With the claims settlement department. So they can look at it. There's built-in versioning and diffing between versions, and they can see, oh, what? That's what I changed? Oh my goodness, that doesn't make sense for us. So this kind of communication is key, and that's where Cavimo kicks in. Even doing operations when you, for example, publish your models in Confluence or your wiki system. Hey, this is how we work nowadays, and Cavimo has features for that, for example. What's also crucial is that once you go live, you have something in place that gives your tech operators, DevOps team, whatever, SREs, insights and, as I said, what has happened in your process instances, how variables have changed, stuff like that, as well as, okay, something's broken, process not continuing, it's stalled somewhere. Why? Not just one, but let's say 1 million. So, it's some backend system where the API is broken, need to fix that. Let's freeze all instances, and once it's back up online, we can continue all instances. So it's batch operations, basically, for process instances. And that's stuff that you will get with this enterprise cockpit. And again, we have seen those that do not sign up for enterprise and are just fine, they typically implemented that themselves. You can do that. You can always, build your own cockpit, so, for example. It's mostly a matter of, do you have the capacity and do you have the time to do that? I mentioned optimize. So I wouldn't say optimize is critical in that sense. You can perfectly well, successfully implement and operate a process automation solution, but it makes a ton of difference, especially here, when you want to expose to your business stakeholders the success of your project. Here's your reports. Here you can see cycle time of that process is 30% shorter. That's the thing. So that's why, we have value, and that's why we have the buy-in for the next increment, for example, or the next project. So I hope I can give that overview here, and it means in a nutshell that, if you're creating a solution in Camunda that is not very complex, or that's not very critical, or that's not very urgent, or if you have lots and lots of developers, the open source version is just fine. I mentioned NASA. NASA started that project for Mars 2020 in 2013. So that's when they started with Camunda. They had 7 years. So they had an abundance of time, and they have very, very strong developer resources. The mission criticality is there. It's also quite complex. It's about processing pictures from the rover, but those other two elements are different, obviously. So this hopefully can help you a bit to identify, does it make sense to take the shortcut, so to speak, with enterprise, or in a way the detour with the open source version. All right, and to wrap this up, we have seen organizations typically starting with some kind of pilot with Camunda, like some IT internal project, for example, like IT service management, incident handling, whatever, proving that it makes sense and getting their feet wet. And then it's all about the lighthouse project. So some core business process that is automated provides value, as then, also demonstrated with stuff like Optimize. And then we have this, not all hell breaks loose, but then we have a strong buy-in to really expand horizontally fairly quickly in the organization and push for that really broad-scale transformation, let it be at banks, insurance, telco, or whatnot. So this, in a way, incremental approach has worked very, very well for most of our customers. All right, I hope I could convey at least a bit of information. Once you do have your stuff in place and you have seen success, do not forget to brag about it. So please come on site to, for example, Camunda Day, like today with Bubble and Health. Come to Berlin for the next user conference, and I think there's another one in the US coming up. So this year, Goldman Sachs, German Telecom, and Deutsche Bahn, for example. Get your recognition that you deserve, and that also helps, of course, within your organization at the end of the day. Cool, thanks.